Okay, good morning, everybody. Um, Thank you very much for joining the Avalon Policy Dialogue, and I would start right away because it's exactly 10 o'clock. So, good morning, everybody, again. My name is Ayodele Adio, and I'm the managing editor of the Avalon Daily. I'd like to welcome you to another edition of the Avalon Policy Dialogue. This year alone, we've held high-level discussions on national security, on housing, and of course, on the digital economy. Today, we'll be focusing on the power sector. We believe that the power sector is critical to any nation's industrialization policy, without which businesses will struggle to survive. Hence, this conversation will be centered around the policy choices governments or those in government can make to deliver a power sector that supports the private sector and that drives industrialization. Thank you very much for choosing your time, for choosing to spend your Saturday with us, and I guarantee you that it'll be worth it. Without further ado, let me introduce our first keynote speaker, Mr. Dion Omonfoman, who is the CEO of New Hampshire Capital. He's an energy expert and has written extensively on power sector reforms on various sectors of the energy sector. May I open the floor for Mr. Odion Omonfoman as he delivers um, his his key his key address. Hello, can you hear us, sir? Hello? I think he's struggling to connect. Um, Hello? All right. Good morning, Mrs. Salaido Saka. It's a pleasure to have you on the Avalon Policy Dialogue on Power. Thank you for joining us for this very important conversation.
Good morning, and thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
All right. First, let me start by asking you how important a role the power sector plays in driving economies forward and supporting industrialization, particularly in West Africa.
Thank you. I think globally, the power sector is critical to economic growth and industrialization, particularly in West Africa, right, where there's still a lot of room for us to build more industrial economies. Access to more reliable, affordable, and clean energy is very important for sustainable development. When we think about energy, there are many aspects of the value chain it contributes to. So, for example, promoting human development, right? With energy, people can read, people can charge their phones, people can learn, people can use the internet. If you also think about productivity, with energy, businesses can provide goods and services. They can make more money. They can employ more people, and ultimately, this sort of trickles down into reducing poverty and increasing economic growth. If you think about how we live, so our standards of living, economic activity, it's really directly or indirectly determined by how much energy we have. And despite this, 600 million people in Africa don't have access to electricity. And this is really a problem that in our lifetime we have to solve.
Thank you very much. So let me ask: is there some sort of a correlation between how much affordable power a country is able to generate and distribute, with how much of global manufacturing that it can attract or that it can enable locally?
Yes, there is extensive research showing a very strong correlation between electricity consumption and GDP growth, right? So effectively, an increase in energy consumption has a positive impact on economic growth. If we look at the data, for example, from Turkey, research there found that a 1% increase in renewable energy consumption increased economic growth by 0.4%. When there was a decrease by 1%, we also saw economic growth drop by 0.7%. In Ghana, it's similar. In 2007 to 2008, what we had in Ghana was load rationing, energy rationing. And with that, we saw the manufacturing sector's contribution to GDP drop from 9.5% to 7.4%. So what this shows is fundamentally, the more you consume, the more your economy will grow. But it isn't enough to just consume electricity. The cost of that electricity is important. If we look at Nigeria, right, there's data from the International Finance Corporation showing that around $17 billion is spent every year on diesel generators and that diesel value chain. This brings our cost of electricity in Nigeria to being 500% more than Norway, right? Businesses in Norway spend around $5 for electricity per kilowatt hour. If you compare that to Ghana, for example, it's about $25 per kilowatt hour. So if a country has lower electricity costs, and because of that, businesses there spend less in terms of their production costs on electricity, then naturally that affects the cost of the goods they're producing, the cost of the services they're offering. So if we're looking at Ghanaian goods, for example, if businesses in Norway are able to produce goods cheaper because electricity is cheaper for them, what that does is that it doesn't boost productivity locally, right? Because even people in Ghana would rather import from where those goods are coming in cheaper. So locally, it destroys competition, and on a global level, it impedes us from being competitive.
I like the fact that you touched on Ghana, and of course, it seems like Ghana has fared a lot better than its neighbors in Nigeria in the power sector. What important lessons can we borrow from what has been quite a relative success from Ghana, such that we can replicate at scale in Nigeria?
I love how you say that success, how you suggest that success is relative, because it is, right? And if I zoom out to sort of the broader region, some countries are making strides. Every country has shortcomings, right? If you zoom in on Ghana, around 80% of the population has access to electricity. That's laudable. The country has more than doubled capacity in the last decade, moving very quickly from having little generation capacity to having more than it needs, which comes with huge financial implications. And so when I think about lessons, I think it's important for us to zoom out and sort of draw from the broader region, because it's not a one-size-fits-all approach, and success is, after all, relative. So with that, from that perspective, I think the first lesson is that it's very important for governments to have a least cost approach, right? And take advantage of the technology that's available now. So if you look at many countries, what you find is that they're state-owned utilities providing power. A lot of those utilities are in debt and need financial support. So if we're keeping just to keep those assets afloat, if we're pouring financing into those sectors that are perhaps not technologically advanced, instead of using that same financing to increase our energy options, I think that's a lesson we need to quickly learn and move away from. We've seen an increase in decentralized solar by more than 100% in sub-Saharan Africa. What lessons can we learn from this? If we say that our grids are debt-ridden and unsustainable, how can we learn the lesson from the fact that solar is increasingly more commercially viable? That's one lesson. The second would be around how can we plan better with reference to data? What we've seen some countries do is just adopt what another country has done. That clearly doesn't work. We need to think of solutions that take into consideration the local context. So is my country, and what natural resources does my country have? How can I tap into that? And I think also incorporating clean energy sources sooner than later. If we're all thinking about only expanding the grid or building or buying more diesel generators, I think more sooner than we plan, we will be left with stranded assets. As the population is growing, we need to think about how can we decentralize power? How can we make it cheaper and faster to give access to people that currently don't have energy? And we need to build better based on the lessons that we've learned. And we need to look towards economies who perhaps have been more sustainable in their approach and incorporate that. I think the last thing I'd say in terms of lessons is they're really only experts on the past. And in charting the future of energy on the continent, we need to think about innovation. We need to think about collaboration. And the future is for those who can innovate and who are willing to collaborate.
Fantastic point you make there. The organization that you lead in Ghana, Daystar, is quite a renewable energy behemoth in the region. May I ask you if the potential, or what the potential of renewable energy is in Africa in terms of powering the private sector activities? Is there some real potential, or it's just buzzwords from fancy panels in World Economic Forums and from the United Kingdom, where it truly has some real potential in Africa?
Yeah, first of all, thank you for deeming it fit to describe Daystar Power as that. We're working quite hard, but we're still only just scratching the surface. I mentioned earlier, right, around how we've seen growth in renewables increase by 100% in sub-Saharan Africa, outside of South Africa, right? This has happened over the last sort of 10 years. And there's a reason for that. First of all, we have the resources. And Africa as a continent has so much sunlight that we're not harnessing. We have the resources. Over time, in the last 10 years as well, we've seen the costs of renewables drop by about 70%, right? In terms of scale and how much it can power the private sector, it really is limitless in terms of what we can power. Just to give you a sense, so Daystar Power, we've designed and installed around 250 solar plants in West Africa, so Nigeria, Ghana, Togo, and Senegal. And our clients are typically businesses and industry. It ranges really from smaller bank branches, smaller petrol stations, hospitals, humanitarian centers, but also we power large industry. One of our clients in Ghana, for example, is a steel plant. We have beverages across the West Africa region, breweries rather, across the West Africa region that we power. We have cosmetic manufacturers. So there really is no limit. It's really a question of how much space do we have available? And if we have that space available, we are able to produce power at a cost that's typically 30% cheaper than the traditional sources. So what we have is a couple of things: the resources available, the commercials that fundamentally make sense and are attractive, and also the team and the talent is able to roll out these solutions.
Interesting. And because, I mean, this summit is about, how the power sector can drive industrialization. Um, may I ask if renewable energy is able to meet the energy demands that are required to drive the industrialization policy of a given country? Is that possible? Or, I mean, renewable energies are just going to work in clusters for certain private enterprises. Is it capable of driving the industrialization policy of a given country?
Absolutely, it is right. It is. If you look towards Europe, for example, or the United States, we're seeing those economies now pay attention to transitioning towards renewables. That's because it can power economies. If you also even consider the status quo where we're coming from, we've been relying on grids and expensive and polluting diesel generators. How has that worked for us? Clearly, it hasn't taken us to the level of industrialization we want. So we need to look ahead and look around to see what works. From a cost and operational perspective, renewables have demonstrated over the last few decades that they work. If you look at installations, for example, yes, there may be high upfront costs, but companies like Desa Power are able to finance these plants and offer them in a model where there's no upfront cost for our clients. We finance the systems, and ultimately, our clients are paying a fee that's 30% cheaper than what they'd have been paying when they were on the grid or when they were using diesel generators. If you look at operation and maintenance as well, right, it's very limited in terms of the O&M that you require. Compare that to your diesel generator. You're familiar with diesel generators in Nigeria. How many times you need to maintain your generator? You see, so when you then consider that, and also time, if you want to go to my village in Abia State to provide electricity to everybody, and you're relying on the grid, you need to build those transmission networks. That takes time. You need to invest a lot of capital. That takes time to raise. So from a time perspective, renewable energy solutions that are decentralized are faster, in addition to, of course, the costs and operational benefits.
Okay, finally, before I let you go, who should take the lead in this initiative? Should it be the government that is taking a giant stride in seeing how renewable energy can be more accessible? Does it have to be some sort of a collaborative effort between the private sector and the government? I guess what I'm trying to ask is what role or what leading role can government play in making renewable energy some sort of center stage in driving the industrialization policy of certain countries along Africa, and particularly Nigeria?
Thank you so much. I could speak for hours on this question in terms of the role the governments need to play. First of all, private sector, we're already in the trenches, right? We're already in the trenches where we have our sleeves rolled up and we're pushing. But ultimately, the scale of the problem, the nature of the problem requires collaboration and support from the government. First of all, it's important for our governments to be introspective. If you're in a place of authority, in a place of government, right, hopefully at the end of your tenure, you want it to be better than you met it. So in the first place, I think we have to align on, do we want to have reliable electricity? Do we want to have clean energy? If the government wants that to be a reality, then that place of introspection then becomes the starting point of having policies that are transparent, that are coherent, that give comfort and give encouragement to private sector, right? The second is sort of encouraging competition. In many countries, what we still see is the government, the state-owned utilities having monopolies. Because of that, it's difficult for private sector renewable energy participants to come in and generate electricity. If this is really something we're serious about doing, we need to see a shift in how we operate there. The last thing I will mention is how we think about policies in terms of coherence and implementation. In many countries in West Africa, there are policies towards accelerating the transition to renewables. But it's one thing to have a policy, it's another thing to be implementing an existing policy. So for example, what you will find is that in some countries, there is no custom duties on paper. But in reality, the customs are either unaware or choose to ignore that. And there are no consequences for that, right? So how can we make sure that if something is a policy, we're following up to see the implementation, we're tracking the data to see how actually it's being used. And let's have policies that attract financing. Nobody wants to invest their money in a place where there's no certainty, where there's no government in the trenches also playing a role for growth. So I think in terms of what we require from government, to sum it up, it's policies that enable growth, policies that help us attract investment into this sector we really want to change.
Thank you, Aledo Osaka, CEO West Africa for Daystar. It's a pleasure to have had you on this policy dialogue, and I hope that we can, have this conversation sometime in the future again.
Thank you for having me.
Okay, so thank you, Aledo, once again for your insightful session. And I'd like to just quickly bring up, our keynote speaker now, who is the CEO of Hampshire Capital, an energy expert who has written extensively on power reforms, on several local and international medium on the subject. May we just please welcome Mr. Modio Amonfoman to the stage now.
Thank you very much, Avalon, for having me, and good morning.
Thank you, sir. So we'll try and upload your presentation while you speak, but you can go ahead now.
Okay, so I think the last speaker did a fantastic job summarizing the points that I will make in my presentation. Thank you, Ledu Osoka, for letting us know that we need policies that will enable growth and investment in the sector. And I think Daystar has demonstrated that with a sound business plan, you can actually provide electricity and power industries, and that will lead to industrialization. Very interestingly, we have had a situation where Nigeria was one of the leading industrialized countries in the 60s and 70s, and we have a situation where we are now struggling to get industrialized again, and a lot of it has to do with the state of the power sector. I'm waiting for the presentation to be uploaded. If it's been uploaded, I can start. Okay, so my short presentation will follow a number of outlines, but I'll go straight to it. And it's important to look at history, where we're coming from in terms of what industrialization is and how electricity and industrialization connect. So in terms of industrialization, the Industrial Revolution pretty much started in the 17th century, 18th century. And the first Industrial Revolution was driven by the use of steam engines, right? And the steam engines were powered by coal. The second period of industrialization took place from the late 19th century to the early 20th century. And then that saw the use of electricity in terms of powering industries. Today, we're in the fifth industrial revolution, and a lot of electricity is being consumed. In fact, I think we consume more electricity in the fifth industrial revolution than the previous revolutions put together, industrial revolutions put together. With the reality and impact of climate change, producing electricity from clean energy sources is now a priority for a sustainable future for mankind. And Nigeria is part of the world. We can't be left out in the process. So it's important that we look at how we can use electricity to power industrialization. Now, in terms of the history of electricity and industrialization, Lagos was the first place that had electricity in the country. And guess what? It was just 30 kilowatts of generating sets, two 30 kilowatt plants that were put by the colonial government. And then in subsequent years, electric power was extended to major towns and urban centers in Nigeria under colonial rule. Between 1923 and 1940, there were several electric power stations established by the colonial government in Port Harcourt, Jos, Kaduna, Kano, Abeokuta, Warri, Enugu, Calabar, and Zaria, just name it. But one of the things that was unique about these towns were towns that had industrial resources, mining resources, and we were also connected by railways. So these were priority areas for the colonial government, making sure that administration and industries were connected to electricity. Now, most of these plants were coal-fired steam generators and were constructed by the Public Works Department of the colonial government and also the Railway Corporation. Then we had a few private entities in the space as well, like the NESCO of Jos and some ATP and P in Sapele. Next slide. So electricity basically was a major driver of industrialization in Nigeria. And in the 1930s, the colonial government established a number of electricity undertakings to push, to ensure that electric supply was distributed around the country. So for instance, we have Jos Industrial Area was powered by NESCO. NESCO was established in 1923. It's actually Nigeria's oldest power generation, transmission, and distribution company that is still existing today. And it was established to provide electricity to the tin mines in the Jos and residences in Bom and Victoria, somewhere in Cameroon. We had the Enugu Power Station that was built in 1933 to provide power to the coal mines in Enugu and the colonial quarters in the southeast region. We had the Jora Power Station, which provided electricity to the industrial areas in colonial Lagos. Then in the north, we have the Chalawa Power Stations and the Sharada Power Stations in Kano. These stations were established in the early 1930s, and they provided electricity to the tanneries in Kano, the railway stations, and then also the colonial quarters in those areas as well. The Kaduna Power Station, established in 1929, served the Kaduna textile companies and the other industries in that area. And then in the Eastern Corridor, you had the Nigerian Eastern Railway Power Station and other power stations that were owned by the Railway Corporation, which provided electricity to towns and commercial corporations such as UAC John Holt, SCOA, and other companies located on the railway terminals, as well as the coal mines. Then down Sapele, you had the Sapele Power Station, which was owned by the Africa Timber and Plywood ATP. A number of these companies are no longer existing. They've probably folded up. However, many of these industrial areas are still in existence today. For instance, Shalawa is a major industrial area in Kano and also Sharada. So these places exist, but guess what? They don't have these power stations that made them, that gave them electricity in their heydays. The next slide, electricity undertakings in colonial Nigeria. The next slide shows you how much electricity that we had in this country during the colonial period, particularly 1928 to 1940. So you can see that electricity was a major driver of our development before independence. It was a major driver of our industrialization, and it was used to ensure that resources that were in land, they were easily accessed, and then exported. Also, it served hospitals, schools, and then the administrative functions of the colonial government. But guess what? It led to a rapid industrialization in colonial Nigeria. Just continuing history, because it's important that we situate certain things before we go into policy changes that need to happen. A number of these things are not rocket science. So history will guide us in what we need to do. In the 30s, we had the Great Depression. We all know about that. Prior to the Great Depression, the cost of electricity was covered from taxes and other revenue sources generated by the native authorities, meaning the local governments and the provincial governments during the colonial period. Then after the Great Depression, there was a fiscal crisis which made the colonial administrators then think of extending power to other consumers who could afford to pay so that they can raise revenue. So electricity beyond industrialization was also a tool to generate revenue. And it was during this period that we had the metering system to start to bill customers who were supplied electricity. And this metering system was rolled out in Lagos, Kano, Kaduna, and Maiduguri. Previously, people just paid their taxes and they got electricity. After the World War II, the colonial government created the Nigerian Electricity Undertakings out of the Public Works Department, which then catered for electricity supply to the wider Nigerians beyond the main industrialized areas that was the core focus of these power stations. And then in 1950, they passed the ordinance that created the Electricity Corporation of Nigeria, which was formally established in 1951. That took over the management of all electricity undertakings and most of the power stations under the Public Works Department, the railway, and native authorities. Post-independence, the Niger Dams Authority was established for the maintenance, construction of electric power dams and other works on the River Niger. We also had the almighty National Electricity Power Authority, NEPA, established in 1972. When NEPA was established, the activities of ECN and the Niger Dams Authority were merged into NEPA, and NEPA had the exclusive responsibility for power generation, transmission, and distribution of electricity in Nigeria, with the exception of NESCO in Jos. I guess some people would say this is where our electricity problems started. In 2005, the Electric Power Sector Reform Act was passed by the National Assembly. The EPSRA wound up NEPA and created the Power Holding Company of Nigeria. PHEN was a holding company made up of several companies spun out of the business operations of NEPA that were now corporatized, which we refer to as successor PHEN companies. In 2013, the privatization of certain successor PHN companies were concluded, mainly the 6 generation companies and 11 electricity distribution companies. So today we have 11 electricity distribution companies spread all over Nigeria, 1 transmission company, and 25 on-grid power generation companies. There are multiple independent power producers off-grid owned by states and also owned by private entities. I must mention, NESCO, founded in 1923, is still in operation and provides reliable electricity to residents and industrial customers in the Bukuru area of Jos from its hydro dams that were constructed in the colonial era Nigeria. Now, where are we today in terms of electricity and industrialization? Nigeria has one of the lowest electricity tariffs in sub-Saharan Africa. It's important to mention that. But however, the impact of low electricity tariffs on competitiveness of our industries is non-existent due to the unreliable nature of public electricity supply from NEPA, then PHEN, now DISCOs, TCN, and GENCOs. Industries rely on diesel generators and gas engines, and more entities like Daystar, they are providing other alternative sources of power. This adds additional capital and operational expenses to their production overheads, which also translates to increased goods and non-competitive nature of their products. There's also huge disruptions to production activities on account of power shortages or failures of alternative power supply. Your generator breaks down, that's not your field, so it affects your production processes. In addition, if you looked at the existing tariff structure in Nigeria, electricity supply to industrial customers is not prioritized. The bulk of electricity supply goes to residential customers, as with any electricity utility. However, in many discos, the quantum of on-grid electricity consumed by industrial customers range from less than 1% to 20% of the disco's total energy received from the grid. If we looked at some of the tables I've put below, you would see that for industrial customers, the D1, D2, 3 category of customers, in Abuja alone, it's less than 1%. The other slides will show that some have as low as in fact, some is even negligible. Now, grid power to industries remain the cheapest source of power, but not for long. The impact of FX instability, high losses, huge debt profile in the sector, high operating costs, and inefficiencies across the entire power sector value chain, and other variables are impacting tariffs, which are currently suppressed. The cost of implementing renewable energy projects in the C&I space has become more competitive, as the previous speakers did mention, and will soon be lower than the cost of grid power for industrial consumers. Nonetheless, wholesale generation costs remain lower than wholesale generation costs across sub-Saharan Africa. Nigeria is blessed with an abundance of natural gas and renewable energy sources, river, solar irradiation, etc., which would ensure Nigeria continues to remain a low-cost power producer. Now, the challenges with existing policies. Electricity policy formulation, as is in this country, is centralized only with the federal government. That's an anomaly. This is against the spirit of the Nigerian Constitution, which provides that the federal government and state government should be responsible for electricity. In addition, there are too many policymakers in the sector. You have the Ministry of Power, you have the Office of the Vice President making policy of the power sector, you have the BP, you have the NCP, you have somebody in the Federal Ministry of Finance, you have the Central Bank, you have the Almighty Presidency, you have NERC and other regulatory agencies all making policies for the power sector. Thus, policy implementation by the federal government is disjointed. It lacks clear coordination amongst the multiplicity of policymakers, and there are a number of ad hoc government project vehicles that have been set up, and these ad hoc project vehicles soon take up policy roles as well, which clearly shouldn't be. In addition, existing policies and regulations do not recognize or prioritize the use of grid electricity to drive industrialization and more industrial activities. For instance, the EPSRA, which is the guiding law in the power sector, makes no provision for wholesale supply or prioritization of electricity to industries. The eligible customer policy, which was a policy that was put up to prioritize somewhat industrial customers, it gave birth to the regulations that was passed in 2017. This policy was to provide industries and large power users with more reliable electricity that would have been stranded due to low cost absorptive capacity of discos to utilize the power. However, the EC regulations, that's the eligible customer regulations, have not solved the electricity problems of industries, including those connected directly to the TCN's network, that's the transmission company of Nigeria's network. To date, only one eligible customer has been approved, despite the excess stranded generation of more than 2,000 megawatts. So we have 2,000 megawatts stranded, we cannot utilize it, yet the policy that should drive the utilization of that excess stranded generation lies comatose, if I may use that language. Now, there's also a lack of market competition at transmission and distribution segments of the power sector value chain. In fact, the way the privatization happened, discos are structured as electricity monopolies within their licensed areas, which for most cases cover multiple states. So for instance, one disco covers the entire Southeast, comprising of 5 states. And that disco serves like a monopoly there. You can't do anything in terms of distributing electricity without their consent or having to pass through them. In addition, on the transmission side, TCN is the sole provider of transmission services across the entire country. Lastly, regulated tariff structure encourages and actually rewards inefficiencies of all the players in the power sector. You have cross subsidies where industrial customers are made to, there's some form of cross subsidy where industrial customers pay higher tariffs to cover for the losses downstream, further down the tariff chain. In other words, residential customers are subsidized. You have issues of capacity charges where GENCOs are paid for capacity that perhaps may not actually be available. You have take-or-pay obligations. You have fixed gas prices in dollars. The sector has a high FX inputs. These are some of the built-in failures of the regulated tariff system that we currently operate in Nigeria. Having talked about the issues, what, in my opinion, are the policy choices or some of the policy choices which I think will drive industrialization in Nigeria? Again, the previous speaker mentioned some of these policies or highlighted some of these policy initiatives, and I would align with her. I will start from saying we should recognize and capitalize on Nigeria's status as a low-cost electric power producer to attract and retain industries into Nigeria. Energy is a major concern for, or a major concern for industries when they look forward to where to site. Of course, there are other factors as well, but access to low-cost energy is a prime factor. The abundance of natural gas and renewable energy resources, hydro resources, solar resources, makes this feasible. We need to have a policy that will designate industrial customers as must-serve customers. For instance, large mining operations. I think there's Seguilola that has just come into the country. That company will be mining for gold somewhere in Ondo State. We're not sure and mining operations for gold, they take a lot of electricity. So you have those large power users, steel mills, who should be designated as must-serve customers in the power sector and thus enjoy grid power. So large power users, heavy industries are usually the bedrock of any electricity market anywhere in the world. Then, as a low-cost wholesale producer of power, hydro GENCOs must have a must-run status to ensure that they are always dispatched by TCN. That policy is in place. However, the power that is dispatched from hydros is used to blend tariffs across the entire sector. I believe there should be a policy to dedicate some of the available capacity of hydros to heavy industries that are connected to the the transmission grid. And I'm referring to companies that currently take their electricity supply at the 330 kV level or the 132 kV level. Now, this may potentially lead to revenue shortfalls by discos because then you would have removed the revenue impact of these heavy industries from their tariffs. But guess what? It presents a net positive benefit to Nigeria in terms of attracting more industries to Nigeria, making sure that the products of these industries are competitive. And once they make money, they also pay taxes as well. So it's a net positive benefit to Nigeria and will spur further industrialization. Then I also think that we should have policies that allow for more bilateral contracts between industries and power producers. However, with less regulatory requirements. So for instance, let's use South Africa, just down the corner of Africa from where we are. Now, the South African government introduced the embedded power program to spur the construction of new generation capacities for industries who are currently struggling with the unreliability of Eskom, which is the South African electricity supplier. Under the new regulations of the South African government, embedded power producers from 100 megawatts and below will not need to go to the regulator in South Africa to get a license to construct those plants. Here in Nigeria, you actually need a license from NERC to build 1 megawatt of power or to distribute from 100 kilowatts of electricity and above. The licensing process is cumbersome, and at the end of the day, a lot of investors are frustrated, and then power is not served. So we need to have a situation where industries can enter into contracts, direct contracts with power producers without NERC having to interfere or put regulatory hurdles in that process. The last speaker talked about decentralizing the power sector, and I completely agree with her. So we need to liberalize and further decentralize the power sector to introduce more competition, particularly at the distribution segment of the value chain. Now, history comes in here. Under colonial Nigeria, the native authorities and private entities built and operated power stations and distribution infrastructure. NESCO, I've talked about NESCO. NESCO is a privately held entity established in 1923. It operates one of the best distribution networks in Nigeria to date, and it operates in parallel with just electricity distribution companies. So this can be done. It's not rocket science to allow for competition and further decentralization of the electricity market in Nigeria. Leading to that, state governments should get involved in electricity business, particularly from a policy and regulatory perspective. Schedule 14 of the legislative list of the Nigerian Constitution makes it the responsibility of state houses of assembly to make laws for electricity, inclusive of generation, transmission, and distribution within their states. So electricity is actually in the concurrent schedule of the Constitution. Lagos State is leading the way in this direction. I'm very excited about the new Lagos State electricity policy that is not only looking at making laws for the electricity sector within Lagos, it also wants to create an electricity market. So it's something that we're keenly watching to see how that will play out. But I would say other states should key into what Lagos State is doing and get involved in the electricity business. One of the anomalies of the EPA SRA is that rural electrification is domiciled with the federal government. That shouldn't be. Rural electrification policies and implementation should actually be within the ambit of state governments and not the federal government. The federal government can support if it chooses to, but to pretty much say rural electrification can either be done only through the DISCOs or through the Rural Electrification Agency sitting somewhere in Abuja. I think it's an anomaly, and it disenfranchises the state governments who are closer to the people and know the rural areas that they need to serve. Now, people have talked about privatizing TCN. I would say the wholesale privatization of TCN is a no-no. The privatization of DISCOs have shown the outcome should we go in that direction. However, there should be policies and regulations to stimulate investments in merchant transmission lines or promoting PPP arrangements between TCN and third parties. Merchant transmission lines means that an investor can develop a line between a GENCO and a load bearer, a supplier, right? And they would earn a tariff from that. But for that to happen, you need to have a decentralized electricity market with less regulations, and parties can contract without having to go through a number of regulatory hurdles. Lastly, the enabling law in the sector, the EPSRA, is no longer fit for purpose. This law was passed in 2005 before the privatization of the sector. So what is required now is wholesale amendment of the EPSRA to align it with the intention of the Constitution, which is making sure that states are involved in electricity business, and also the realities of the competitive market and Nigeria's unique challenges and development aspirations as enumerated above. In particular, Section 62(1) of the EPSRA needs to be amended. That section is actually what says that you cannot generate, transmit, or distribute electricity without going to NERC to get a license. I believe if there are a number of policy changes in this direction, it would improve access to electricity by industries. It would make the electricity sector a lot more competitive. It would attract investments into the sector, as highlighted by the last speaker, and it would lead to much more industrialization in this country. So these are some of the policy changes that I think needs to happen for us to further industrialize as a country. Thank you very much.
Thank you very, very much, Mr. Dion, for quite a robust paper that you have delivered. And I'm hoping that those saddled with the responsibility of making this very important but difficult changes would have the courage and the political will to do just that, so that we can have we can be more competitive globally and have a better incentivized private sector. Thank you very, very much, and I appreciate it. So without wasting much time, we have about 25 minutes left, so I'll quickly bring into the conversation Engineer Hafiz Momo, who is the head of the Power Department of the Ministry of Energy and Mineral Resources. He will be speaking on behalf of the Commissioner for Energy for Lagos State. And I would also be bringing on stage Mrs. Chinaya Ajayi, who is an associate partner of Probitus Partners in Lagos, who would also be speaking on the legal hurdles that are being faced in driving the policy changes, that we require. Engineer Hafiz, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. 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 Yes, I can hear you.
I think your listening was echoing. Ms. China Ajayi, also thank you for joining this conversation. It's great to have you here.
Thank you very much. It's my pleasure.
Let me start with you because, the keynote address and in the paper delivered by Olaido, there's been so much talk about decentralization of the power sector in Nigeria as a way to make it a lot more efficient and a lot more effective. Let me start by asking you, what are the legal hurdles that has made it difficult for it to be decentralized, and why are state governments not being able to also become a big player in this sector, and everything has just been revolving around the federal government?
Okay, thank you very much. So just like the keynote speaker spoke, Mr. Odion, the problem actually starts with the original law, which is the EPSRA. Everything is kind of focused on the federal government. And then they've also been this clamor again with respect to the Constitution, if electricity is something that is exclusive or concurrent. And now we've seen some state governments actually take steps. For instance, I think I became aware of Ondo State's power reform law. It's actually a very nice step. But then there's also the challenge of licensing. So you have someone who is looking to invest in the power sector, and then has an issue with, do I just get license from NEC, or do I need to get license from NEC and then get license from the state government. So when you have the issues like this, you have inconsistencies, you have lack of clarity, you have it becomes unpredictable. And this, once we have these issues, then it's a bar for people to for investors to actually come in within the sector. So I think it's important to have a clear cut. The law needs to be very clear on the extent of the involvement of state government, and I believe state government should be involved. For instance, in South Africa, really, there's a lot of involvement from the state government. We have over 186 distribution companies, not just at the federal level, but at the state and even the local government level. Given the importance of power in industrialization, I think it's not something that the federal government should focus on. There should be some form of liberalization that allows state government participate. So I think first of it starts with amending the EPSRA, particularly first moving REA, that's the rural electrification project or aspect of it, down to the state government, and then local government if possible. This will encourage participation even at the grassroots level. People at the very least level in the society can participate in contributing to making the energy sector actually work. So I believe first we need to that is a big hurdle. Then on the second hurdle, I also want to talk about is the issue of the licensing process. Of course, we have, like Oledo rightly said, you have policies, and then you have laws, and then you have implementation issues. So you have a regulation that says you can get your license within 30 days, and then you have an investor that comes in and wants to invest, and then he's having to stay for like 6 months, 3 months applying for licenses. So these are hurdles. And then you also have issues around procedure requirements. For instance, we are aware that about 80 million about over 50% of Nigerians are not connected to the grid, meaning that we have to explore off-grid options for those areas. But then when you look at the mini-grid regulation, for instance, one of the requirements you have is that you need to, if your mini-grid will be located in an area where a distribution company has an expansion plan within the next 5 years, then you need to get their consent, meaning for you to locate your mini-grid in an area that is covered within the 5-year expansion plan of the DISCO, you need to get the consent of the DISCO. Now, this is, if you ask, this is my opinion, a very big hurdle. Okay, what if the DISCO doesn't give the consent? The regulation is actually very silent on the role that NEC has to play. So those little hurdles are things that can actually inhibit development and development, particularly in the power sector. And then we also have the issue of enforcement. This is also a very big hurdle. We have plethora of regulations in the sector, but then we have a lot of challenge around enforcement. You hardly see the regulator actually enforcing these provisions. Ability to enforce gives confidence to investors. When people know that when laws are breached, they can actually people can get punished for it. Then it gives incentive, it motivates people to invest. But at the time where you have laws that are rarely implemented, or even if they're implemented, they're not enforced, then there's no motivation to invest. So we can go on and on, but the hurdles are a lot. Even in terms of transparency, you have, for instance, you have the number of grants, policies around. What's the process for application? The process for application is actually not transparent. You don't know what documents to put in. It needs to be predictable. An investor should know that when I submit this document, do this, do that, then I get my license out, or I get this done. So I think a lot of issue around predictability, transparency, certainty, and consistency. I must add this very last point, Ayo. Now let me give an instance on the metering, for instance, the metering value chain in the power sector. We've had changes in policies over time. We started with the CAPME scheme, where customers were not meant to pay for meters, and then we progressed to MAP, where customers were meant to pay, and then eventually we now have a new one that just came out, I think earlier in the month, that merges to the Nigerian mass metering policy with MAP. So we have inconsistencies, and investors need to be sure that their investment will be protected. So when policies are changing here and there is no confidence. And these are things that need to be cleared up if you must boost the power sector to promote industrialization.
Thank you, Chinaya. Engineer Hafiz, Lagos State actually carries more than half of the manufacturing sector in the country. And that makes it more critical for Lagos to have a more robust power sector that can support the businesses and the private sector in Lagos. Let me start by asking you, because Mr. Odion talked about some of the initiatives that you're doing in Lagos State and the progress that you have made. Let me start by asking you what progress Lagos State has made in the power sector as it supports many of the industries in Lagos State and, of course, the private sector.
Thank you for the initiative and the forum that has brought stakeholders in the power industry and also members of the public, on power. I would like to start by just saying that Lagos State, is known to be the financial nerve center of the country and of Africa's and one of Africa's few mega cities. It houses the most major headquarters of financial service providers, corporate organizations, NGOs, industries. Lagos State is estimated to have about 27 million population. And in addition to that, with 2014 estimates, the GDP is was about $91 billion, which accounts for 20% of Nigeria's GDP. About 53% of manufacturing employment in Nigeria is in Lagos, which also accounts for 70% of our national GDP. And going further, we realize that according to Man Economic Review, they've informed that in a day they have about nothing less than 6 power outages, and aggregately they enjoy just about 4 hours of electricity in a day, which affects and hinders production. And as a result, commercial and industrial activity have been significantly curtailed and made costlier for decades. Industries have been forced to resort to expensive alternative supply, which makes their product uncompetitive with imported goods. And we also know that the massive growth in economic activity in the state during the past 2 decades has been powered by a population, 2/3 of which the World Bank estimates to be living in slum. And in the realization of this, the Lagos State government is focused on enabling its residents, citizens, businesses, and ventures to thrive and innovate through policies and programs that can raise the standard of living and reduce cost of doing businesses in the state. Key to this strategic objective is the continuous improvement of state infrastructure, particularly those with electricity supply. And you agree with me that the Lagos State government had made several attempts at tackling the electricity challenge over the years. First, by supporting the development of the Aeron power badges in return for dedication of part of the output to Lagos industries. And this was about 2 decades ago, 20 years back. And 10 years later, the Lagos State government also promoted the installation of independent power plants, which were able to generate about 50 megawatts, though for Lagos State agencies, for Lagos State government agencies and offices. And in addition to that, in 2018, we were able to enact the power sector, the Lagos State Power Sector Reform Law. And this law was intended to provide a basis for significant private sector investments into the fledgling Lagos electricity market. It also provided for the Lagos State Electricity Board to take responsibility for driving rural electrification. The entire population of Lagos State, to varying degrees, lacks reliable and public power supply. And we also realized that the law that was enacted in 2018 was not actually adequate towards the vital strategic goal of the state. Ultimately, in spite of these efforts, all areas of the state are not served and all at all, while all others are grossly underserved. And it is in this realization that, and coupled to the fact that presently, in addition to the 27 million residents we talked about, when we look at the growth in the state generally, we talk about the Dangote refinery, we talk about the Lekki Free Trade Zone. These are commercial and industrial areas that are coming up, which means there will be more demand for power in Lagos State. And in addition to that, we have the Eco Atlantic City project, which would also, demand for more power. And our strategic objective in Lagos State was, is to build an electricity system that enables our collective prosperity and customer satisfaction in an environment that fosters the innovation, easy adoption of current and future technologies. And the Lagos State government is not resting on its hands. And presently, or in recent time, we had a collaboration with United States Agency for International Development, and we've been able to come up with integrated energy resource plan, which has predicted the load demand for Lagos State for the next 20 years. And in addition to that, the state is realizing that the 2018 power sector reform law would not achieve our objective. The state currently is developing policies and also laws that would accommodate a more robust power sector in the state. Furthermore, we came up with a consultation paper whereby we invited stakeholders to make their contribution, so that because we know that as a state we can't do it alone. And
okay, engineer, I wanted to, because we're pressed for time, I don't want to keep us beyond the allotted time.
Okay. Okay. Let me just say this. Okay. With the Lagos State policy and the law that are being developed, I believe that the dream of having constant, reliable electricity in Lagos State would be achieved. And in addition to that, we've realized that we've carried out studies on renewables. We've realized that deploying renewables where we have unserved areas is cheaper than having the grid connected. So the renewable side of electricity supply is highly being considered. Thank you.
Thank you, Engineer. Thank you, Engineer Hafiz. you could just still stick around for the next 10 minutes because there are probably a question or two that we may still have to draw you into. Very quickly, Chinaya, one of the things that baffles me about the power sector, is the fact that oftentimes there is excess power that even the federal government is often willing to sell that excess power to other countries when the need arises. Is there a legal hurdle that stops this excess power from being redistributed within the country, such that where there is excess generated power, it can be distributed to areas that often needs more power, so that they can supply those areas with more needs rather than export. Of course, I know that we need foreign exchange, but I mean, there's a lot of underserved population in Nigeria. Is there an enabling law that stops that from happening, or do we need a law to essentially make that happen?
Well, thank you. On that, it's actually within the purview of the federal government, but I know that for that to happen, at least there must be an understanding between Nigeria and the country that is being given the electricity. But to further, expatiate, on this, Lagos, for instance, our distribution infrastructure cannot accommodate more than 1,500 megawatts. So no matter, and even in Lagos State, you see the discos rejecting power. And so which means even the power that is being exported, if it is left in Lagos State, the infrastructure is not adequate to make the power distributed. And is one of the reasons why the Lagos State government is coming up with the policy and law, so that we are leveraging on the concurrent legislative law, the Section 14, and with this we can have independent that the private investors that would come up with distribution infrastructure, that would be able to bring in more power into the system.
Chinaya?
Okay, yes. Okay, so basically, really, I think the most of the problem is not most of the issues is actually around infrastructural deficit that hinders distribution to other local use, basically. But in terms of the legal aspect, I would say there are regulations that cover selling off grid, as generation companies selling to other domestic users like estates and all of that. But then, like, the problem has always been in terms of implementation. An instance, just like Mr. Our keynote speaker actually mentioned, is the eligible customer. This is an one legal framework that allows generation companies to sell to high demand users. But then, since the regulation was passed in 2018, little has been done to actually see implementation. It means it's actually not working. So there's a need to actually review things around that. Then they also have things there's also the framework of embedded regulation that allow generation companies to transport or move their excess power through existing distribution networks to consumers. But then for you to do this, you have to have some form of collaboration, agreement with the discos, and then you also need to agree on tariff, and then you also need to obtain a license as well. So you have the hurdle around the licensing procedure. Sometimes licensing takes a lot of time. And secondly, you also have issues around agreeing with the discos. Sometimes it's for discos to actually get to a meeting point with private investors. There's usually issues around that. Agreeing on tariff methodology, that's also on that hurdle that needs to be crossed in order to because tariff is actually highly regulated, so that hurdle has to be crossed. It has to be simplified, really, if you must see a lot of activity around that space. And then you also need to get even in the event that you don't want to use the embedded, that's the existing distribution networks, there's also a regulation that allows you to apply for independent electricity distribution networks. So we have independent, not the usual discos that we have. Private investors can actually develop their own distribution networks. But again, you have to apply for licenses, and then you have to You have to work out certain things with the discos as well within that area. So the thing is, there are regulations, there are laws that cover these things, but the simplicity, the transparency, and the predictability of these regulations remain the issue, and most importantly, implementation. So I think for the legal aspect of the legal framework, I think a lot has to do with implementation and a lot has to do with enforcement. And this also comes from the political will. Are they really, is it, do they really want to do this? I think once we are able to cross the hurdle of the political will and then implementation, I think we can see a lot of positive output from that space.
Mr. Odon, you wanted to speak to it?
Is it me? Did you ask a question to me?
Yes, you wanted to speak to the issue.
Oh no! In terms of what you said, I think at the end of the day, it's just about encouraging more competition at the last mile level. The truth of the matter is that you may have eligible customer policies, regulations along those lines, but if the customer is not free to determine who will serve him electricity when they are, just as a switch, to switch over to better services, then you're going to struggle. For instance, in telecoms, you can port your line. If you're not happy with Glo, you go to MTN, you go to Airtel. In the power sector, you're stuck with whatever disco is providing you service, regardless of the fact that all the disco provides are the lines. Somebody else can string cleaner lines. In JOS, you have customers in JOS have a choice of choosing between JOS Electricity Disco and Nesco. Nesco has 24/7 power. Everybody's running to Nesco for service, and guess what? Their tariffs are a lot cheaper than JOS Disco. So it's not a big deal. We just need to further decentralize the last mile part of it, where customers have a choice. We also, industrial customers can decide who they want to buy their power from a wholesale basis. So it's not a really big deal. We just need further decentralization of the sector via an act of the government and also state governments getting involved as well, like Lagos State is doing.
All right. So final question before we go, and I'm hoping we can take this in a minute each. I understand that we cannot just bite the elephant in one major bite. And if we really want to drive the business sector in Nigeria, or the industrialization sector in Nigeria, such that we can attract even global manufacturing into our country that will create jobs, isn't it feasible for us to have industrial clusters where we can focus on providing cheap and affordable power in those particular areas where certain industries are located, or where people want to set up industries, so that they can have as much power supply at the cheaper rates to power the industrialization sector? Why is that not happening? And how can that happen such that we can start solving our problems bit by bit? Because manufacturers continue to cry that the power sector is their greatest challenge. Shouldn't we be solving that?
We actually have industrial clusters. A lot of industrial clusters. So it's not about, if you go to Shagamu area, the interchange, there's a huge industrial cluster. In fact, one of Africa's largest breweries is located around that area. The world's largest brewery is building a very big brewery there. That area has no electricity. That area is served by a distribution company who does not have the resource to put power in that area. So you now have other entities playing in that space, like Axela building a gas pipeline to that area, and then these companies are now going to invest in a generation that is not their forte. So these things happen. What you need is to deregulate or decentralize it such that if Ibadan Disco is unable to provide power in that area, other investors can come in there and put power. To blow your mind, there are 2 power plants within 40 kilometers of that area. What does it take to construct a line from one of these power plants to serve that area? All it needs is regulation, but the existing regulations and policies will not make this happen. That's why the EPSR is outdated and needs to be updated to reflect today's reality. Without it, we're just struggling and going around. Alternatively, Ogun State can go in there, make its laws, and then allow investors go in there and serve these customers. If the federal government is still dilly-dallying on changing the regulations that would allow for these policies to take place.
Chinaya?
Yeah, I also
Okay.
want to look at it from the point. Mr. John had talked about the industrial areas. On that potential area for boosting industrialization as the rural areas, which actually totally off grid. So we can we already talked about that things around renewables, mini grids are workable in those areas. These are fast, as in it doesn't take you so the time and energy and resources required to connect a grid to those areas cannot be compared with setting up things like solar panels, solar farms, and all. So I think in that area we can actually start boosting industrialization from SMEs, from small businesses, by providing them with power. Now, when you have about almost 50% of Nigerians not having access, that's a huge potential out there. So I feel beginning we already have the mini grid, but I think we can do more as with setting up legal frameworks, laws that will encourage people to go in there, those rural areas, and begin to develop power projects, mini grids that can actually boost economic activities. Because once there is power, certainly economic activities follow immediately.
Engineer?
Thank you. I would say that Lagos State government has been doing something in this in respect of the industrial areas, but we are starting with residential areas as in form of a pilot project, and it has started as I speak. We are having a program, accelerated power program, which is like a community electrification program, and which is meant to be extended to commercial and industrial areas as well. The project is a collaborative one between the Lagos State government, the DISCOs, and the pilot project is being funded by African Development Bank. And subsequently, private sectors will come in after we might have achieved success in the first 6 locations that we picked. We actually picked the economically disadvantaged areas. We picked 2 areas in Animosho, 1 area in Agege, 1 in Surulere, 1 in Mushi, and 1 in Ibetuleki. So we're already working in that direction. But the only challenge we are having presently, why we've not made much progress, is the law which I talked about, because it involves having franchisees, and the present 2018 power sector law does not accommodate that. So it's part of what we are. From the law that is being reviewed, all these will be taken into consideration, and we can have a smooth ride on the project. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so very much, everyone. I think there are key issues that have been brought to bear here. One of them is the fact that we have to decentralize. We need states and local government to take more responsibility in terms of rural electrification. We need to continue to rethink some of the legal provisions that are inhibitive, and to make them a lot more progressive. We need to cut down the red tapes. We need a lot of transparency, and above all, we need a lot of political will to see some of the brilliant ideas that are already on paper, to see them through. Thank you very much to everyone for the brilliant takes and insightful analysis. To the head of Power Department and Energy and Mineral Resources, Engineer Fiz, thank you for your time. To Mr. Dion Moffman, who delivered a fantastic keynote. Thank you so much for taking your Saturday to spend with us. To Mrs. Chinene Ajayi, who is an associate partner with Probitas, who also hosts an interesting podcast in the electricity sector. Thank you for taking your Saturday to spend with us. And to Olaide Osaka, who dropped off, and to others who also joined the conversation, thank you very much. And we hope that we can have a more progressive power sector in the near future. Thank you very much. And on behalf of the Avalon Daily and the Avalon Policy Report, thank you very much. And we'll see you again sometime next month in our next policy dialogue. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.